My son-in-law handed me a typed list of rules the first time I drove to Murfreesboro to see my granddaughter after my wife's funeral. I had pulled into the driveway with a stuffed rabbit on the passenger seat, soft gray, velvet ears, the kind of thing my wife had picked out months earlier and set aside on the top shelf of the hallway closet for a birthday that came too late for her to attend. I brought it because it felt like the right thing to carry, like I was delivering some small piece of her that still wanted to arrive. My son-in-law answered the door. He smiled the way he always smiled, quick, wide, the kind of smile that comes just a half second too fast to feel entirely real. He said it was good to see me. He said my daughter was getting my granddaughter ready upstairs. And then he said he actually had something he wanted to go over first, if I didn't mind, and he handed me 2 folded pages he had been holding behind the doorframe. I stood on the front porch in my good coat and read them. It was a typed document, organized into sections. Visit schedule. Every other Saturday, 3-hour maximum. No exceptions without 7 2-hour advance notice, submitted in writing. Gift policy. All gifts to be pre-approved by text message. No battery-operated toys. No food items of any kind. Communication protocol. All scheduling to go through my son-in-law's personal email. No contacting my daughter directly about visit logistics. A clause about not discussing my wife's passing in front of my granddaughter without prior agreement. A clause about not making promises to my granddaughter about future visits or future plans. A line at the bottom for my signature. My daughter's name did not appear on the document anywhere. I read it twice. My son-in-law stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. I looked up at him and said, "Did she write this with you?" He said they had put it together as a team. He said they both felt that clear expectations would help things run more smoothly. He used the word alignment 3 times in the space of 90 seconds. I folded the document. I put it in my coat pocket. I did not sign it. I said I appreciated knowing where things stood. Then my daughter came downstairs with my granddaughter balanced on her hip, and my granddaughter reached for me with both arms the way she always did, the way that makes every other thing in a room go instantly quiet, and I held her and I did not think about the document again for 3 hours. I thought about it the entire drive home. My name is Ray Caldwell. I'm 57 years old. I spent 28 years as a licensed electrician in Knox County commercial work, mostly schools and hospital wings and public buildings, where the specifications are thick and the tolerance for error is essentially 0. I retired 2 years ago when my wife got her first diagnosis. She had a stroke in February, a second one in April, and she was gone by the end of June. She was 54 years old. She was the kind of woman who kept a running list on the refrigerator of things she wanted to do. Not a bucket list, she hated that phrase. Said it sounded like you'd already given up, just a list she called "What's Next," written in her handwriting on yellow legal pads she kept in the kitchen drawer. She had filled 3 of them. She had plans the way some people have opinions, constantly and without apology. And she had energy that made younger people feel like they were moving through water. She adored our granddaughter in a way that was almost embarrassing to witness if you didn't know her, and completely expected if you did. When my daughter called from the hospital to say the baby had arrived, my wife cried in the parking structure before we even walked inside, just from the knowing of it. She used to say that becoming a grandmother was the reward you never fully understood you had been earning until you held the proof of it. She got 3 years with her granddaughter. She drove to Murfreesboro with her car packed full of picture books and sat on the floor for entire afternoons. She sang to her on video calls every Tuesday at 7 o'clock. She had a voice that was not technically impressive but was delivered with such absolute commitment that my granddaughter accepted it as the best singing she had ever heard. When my wife died, my granddaughter asked my daughter where Grandma had gone. My daughter told her Grandma had gone to live in the stars. My granddaughter looked at the ceiling fan turning slowly above them and asked if that was close enough to count. I thought about that story on the drive to Murfreesboro. I thought about it on the drive home. My son-in-law had always run things a particular way. He was a project manager for a logistics company in Nashville, and he brought the same framework to his household that he brought to his quarterly reviews, timelines, approval chains, clearly defined roles. My daughter was an elementary school teacher. She was warm and patient and occasionally stretched thin, and she had loved him since her mid-20s with the kind of certainty that made it nearly impossible to raise a concern without sounding like you were raising an accusation. So I had been careful. I had always called ahead. I had never dropped by unannounced. I had not offered opinions on their choices unless directly asked, and sometimes not even then. My wife had been better at navigating the particular atmosphere of their house than I was. She had an instinct for knowing how much space to take up and when to take up less. I tend to fill corners without meaning to. It is something I have been working on for almost 6 decades with mixed results. After my wife died, I had thought something might soften. Grief does that sometimes loosens the framework, lets people remember what matters. I was wrong about that. If anything, the framework tightened. The every other Saturday rule was observed strictly for about 2 months. Then a Saturday came where I drove 2 hours and my son-in-law met me at the door to say my granddaughter was under the weather and it wasn't a good time. I drove 4 hours round trip for a 4-minute conversation on a porch. The following Saturday had a conflict I was informed of on Friday evening. The Saturday after that, the confirmation text I sent went unanswered until late in the day, at which point he suggested Sunday might work better, and when I rearranged my weekend and drove out on Sunday, my daughter looked surprised to see me, which told me the Sunday suggestion had been communicated only in my direction. I brought it up carefully with my daughter on a phone call that week. I said I was having trouble getting consistent time with her daughter. She apologized for the confusion. She said her husband meant well. She said he was just very particular about keeping things on schedule. She said it in the tone she had always used when she was explaining him to me, patient and slightly exhausted at the same time. I said I understood. I said I just missed her girl. She got quiet for a moment that lasted longer than a moment, and then she said, softly, "I know, Dad." The second document came as an email about 4 months after the first. He had written it himself. It was longer this time, more elaborately framed. It referenced an ongoing family dynamic and his belief that healthy relationships require structural clarity. It noted that since I was now retired and living alone, I had a scheduling flexibility that their household simply did not have. It expressed concern, carefully worded, almost clinical about the emotional impact of inconsistent visits on my granddaughter's routine. It described her as a child who thrived on predictability, which was true, although what she seemed to thrive on most, from what I had observed, was being outside and telling jokes and eating things directly off the ground before adults could intervene. And then, toward the bottom of the email, after 3 paragraphs of framing I can only describe as lawyerly without being legal, it made a request. He called it a shared investment in family stability. He said he had been thinking about it carefully. He said that given my granddaughter's future needs, her education, her enrichment, the costs of raising a child, well, it seemed reasonable to ask me to contribute $600 a month into a savings account he managed. In exchange, he would expand visits to weekly and remove the advanced scheduling requirement for phone calls with my daughter. He described it as a way for me to be meaningfully involved. He said he hoped I would see it as an opportunity. I sat at the kitchen table where my wife and I used to drink our coffee every morning, and I read that email 4 times. $600 a month. To see my own granddaughter, my daughter's child, the little girl who waved crayons at me like they were proof of something important. I thought about the $40,000. 3 years earlier, my son-in-law had come to me with a business plan. A warehousing consulting firm, he had called it. A niche service for small logistics operations in Middle Tennessee. He had a presentation, a projected revenue model, a timeline that was detailed enough to feel credible. He had a tone of complete confidence, the kind that comes naturally to people who have never been wrong out loud. He needed startup capital, he said, and he wanted to keep it in the family rather than go to a bank. I had written the check from money I had set aside after selling my parents' property in Morristown. It was a loan, not a gift. Though we'd kept the terms informal family terms, I had thought at the time, which turned out to be one of the more expensive assumptions of my life. He made 2 repayments in the first 6 months. After that, nothing. When I brought it up, he talked about pivots and reinvestment, and the long runway of a startup finding its footing. My wife told me to give it time. I gave it time. The time had not resolved the situation. I did not respond to the email that night. I drove to the hardware store the next morning, not because I needed anything, just because I needed fluorescent lights and the smell of raw lumber and the uncomplicated company of people who wanted things that could be measured. I walked the electrical aisle for 20 minutes. Then I drove home and I called my neighbor Frank. Frank had been my closest friend for 14 years. He had sat in a lawn chair in my driveway every Friday evening while my wife declined, and when she couldn't come to the window anymore, he had moved the lawn chair inside without being asked. He listened to the entire story. When I finished, he said, You remember what Ellen went through with her son-in-law? I said I remembered pieces of it. He said she had found a family attorney in Nashville, a woman named Patricia Holm, patient and precise, the kind who didn't need to raise her voice to be perfectly understood. He said Ellen still had the card. I called Patricia Holmes' office the following morning. Her assistant put me through within half an hour, and I spent nearly an hour on the phone going through everything, in order: the documents, the canceled visits, the escalating restrictions, the $600 email, the loan. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she paused, and then told me she had a few things she wanted me to do before our next conversation. Save every communication my son-in-law had sent me. Write down every visit that had been canceled, with dates and whatever explanation had been given. Keep calling my daughter and stay close with her without mentioning any of this. And contact my accountant about the $40,000. I called Gordon Webb that same afternoon. Gordon had done my taxes since I was 42, and he kept records with the kind of organized permanence that made him slightly unnerving to be around but very reassuring to hire. He pulled the wire transfer confirmation, the email exchanges where my son-in-law had laid out the business plan, and thanked me warmly, the 2 repayment deposits, and then the long silence after. He asked if there was a written loan agreement. I told him it had been informal. He said that complicated things but didn't necessarily end them, and he'd see what the paper trail could show from my side of the transaction. What he found took several days to fully surface. The $40,000 had gone into the business account as expected. Within 6 weeks of arriving, a large portion had moved back out. Some to vendors plausible, Gordon said, consistent with a startup. But roughly $24,000 had been transferred in a series of smaller movements to a personal account that was not the joint account my son-in-law shared with my daughter. Gordon couldn't access that account, but the outbound transfers were visible on the business side and fully documented. Then my daughter answered the question I hadn't yet known how to ask. She was texting a friend and sent me a screenshot by mistake, a partial image of a credit card statement in her husband's name. She caught it immediately, texted me saying, "Sorry, wrong person. Ignore that." I had already seen it. The balance was over $30,000. The charges on the visible portion included payments to a boat dealership in Smyrna, a premium hunting lease operation near Tullahoma that I recognized from advertisements in the regional outdoors magazines at the barbershop, hotel charges that didn't match any business travel I had ever heard him mention, and membership fees to a private sporting club with an address in Williamson County. I sat with that screenshot for a long time. My daughter didn't know. I was almost certain of it. She didn't know that the money I had lent her husband, money from my parents' land, money my wife and I had carefully set aside, had not built a business. It had built a boat and a lease on hunting land and a membership to a club she had probably never visited. She was teaching 4th graders long division and raising a child and managing a household under a framework of rules as rigid as the ones her husband had drafted for me, and she had no idea what had happened to $40,000 of her family's money. That made everything else make sense in a way that was worse than the confusion had been. I called Patricia home the next morning. I told her about the credit card statement and what Gordon had documented. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said we had enough. She would draft a formal demand letter for loan repayment, now supported by evidence of misuse rather than just an informal agreement, and she would formally assert my grandparent visitation rights under Tennessee family law, which allows a grandparent to petition the court for access when that access is being unreasonably withheld, particularly when the denial is being used as financial leverage. She said the letter would not be aggressive. It would simply be accurate, she said, in the way that accuracy sometimes does not need to be anything else. I asked how long. She said 10 days to get it exactly right. I said that was fine. I kept driving to Murfreesboro on my scheduled Saturdays. I kept sending the 7-2-hour advance confirmation emails. I kept parking on the street. My son-in-law kept opening the door with his quick, practiced smile. I sat on their couch and watched my granddaughter narrate everything she was doing as she was doing it, as 4-year-olds do, like a sportscaster covering an event only they can fully appreciate. She showed me a crayon she had named Gerald. She showed me a rock she had found in the backyard that she believed was special, though she was still working out why. She climbed up next to me one afternoon and looked at me with the seriousness that only small children can fully commit to and said, "Grandpa, do you miss Grandma?" I said yes, I did. She said, "Me too." Then she said, "Does she watch us from the stars?" I said I believed she did. She thought about this for a moment, weighing it the way she weighed most things. Then she held up Gerald the crayon and said, "Then she can probably see this." I held myself together. I am still not entirely sure how. When Patricia told me the documents were ready, I drove to her office and picked them up myself. I put them in a manila folder. The folder held the demand letter, Gordon's financial summary with the transfer records and dates, a printout of the public business registry showing that my son-in-law's consulting firm had been administratively dissolved by the state 8 months earlier for failure to file its annual report, and a 2-page summary of Tennessee grandparent visitation law with the relevant statutes marked clearly. I did not send an advance email. That was the one rule I broke. I drove to Murfreesboro on a Thursday evening. His truck was in the driveway. I parked on the street, walked up the front steps, and knocked. He answered. He looked surprised, genuinely surprised, which was the most honest expression I had seen from him in quite a while. He started to say something about the scheduling protocol, and I said quietly that this would not take long, that I had something I needed both of them to see. I asked if my daughter was home. She came to the door a moment later, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked at me, then at the folder in my hand, then back at me. I said I needed them to read something. I handed my son-in-law the folder. He opened it. He took out the first page, Patricia's demand letter, and he began to read. I watched his face the way I have watched load-bearing calculations come in under spec, looking for the exact moment the weight becomes visible. It took about 40 seconds. He reached the section describing the business account transfers, and his jaw changed. Not dramatically, just said in a way I had not seen before. My daughter had moved beside him. She reached into the folder herself and took out Gordon's financial summary. She read it standing in the doorway of her own house. I watched her reach the part about the transfers. I watched her stop reading. I watched her read that section again. She looked up at her husband. He said it wasn't what it looked like. She said, "What does it look like?" He reached for the register he used when he was managing a difficult conversation, organized, measured, slightly above the emotion in the room, and it simply didn't come this time. He said the business had been restructured. He said the funds were all accounted for. He said my accountant didn't have the full picture. My daughter held the paper and looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I recognized the expression on her face. I had seen it when she was 17 and had figured out something she had believed for a long time was not true. She had always been fast at processing. She had always deeply disliked being managed. I said, "I am not here to cause a scene. I am here because you deserve to see this, and because I want to be part of my granddaughter's life without it being a negotiation." My son-in-law turned to me and began to speak, and I said, gently, "The business was dissolved by the state 8 months ago. It's in the folder." He didn't say anything after that. My daughter asked me to come inside. We sat at their kitchen table for almost 2 hours. My son-in-law tried several approaches: restructuring, transitional funds, long-term plans that explained the short-term movements. The documentation didn't leave him many solid places to stand. Somewhere in the second hour, he stopped constructing explanations and just sat with his arms crossed and his eyes on the table in front of him, which is what happens when a person has used up all their available story. My daughter drove home with me after I left and sat in my passenger seat without speaking for the first 10 minutes on the interstate. Then she said, "How long did you know?" I told her the full timeline. She listened. She didn't cry. She got the same expression she had gotten at the door, the one that meant she was processing fast and hard and would have questions for herself to answer later that I would not be able to answer for her. There were many conversations in the months that followed, some of which I was part of, most of which I was not. That is my daughter's story to carry, not mine to summarize. What I can tell you is that 6 months later, my son-in-law had moved out of the Murfreesboro house. There was a formal separation, attorneys on both sides, a process that was slow and depleting in the way those processes always are. Patricia advised me that the loan would be addressed in the settlement. Most of it was. Some of it, the portion we couldn't fully document past the point of transfer, Gordon told me, wasn't worth the cost to pursue separately. I agreed. Some losses are the price of a lesson you needed to learn, and I had not learned it cheaply enough the first time. My granddaughter and I go to Centennial Park on Saturday mornings now. We bring bread for the ducks. She has named them all with a specificity that suggests she believes names are the most important thing you can give another creature. There is one called Doorknob, one called Henrietta, one she refers to only as the big one, in a tone that implies she considers the absence of a name to be self-explanatory to any reasonable observer. She talks constantly. She has my wife's instinct for finding something worth saying in any silence that opens up. Last weekend, she stopped in the middle of the walking bridge over the lake and looked up at me and said, "Grandpa, I want Grandma to see the ducks." I said I thought Grandma could probably see them from where she was. She considered this seriously, in the way she considers most things, with her chin slightly down and her eyes moving like she is running numbers. Then she said, "I'm going to wave so she knows which ones have names." And she waved at the sky. Full arm extended, the way you wave at someone across a wide parking lot, the way you wave when you want to make absolutely sure you have been seen. I could not speak for a minute. I just stood there on that bridge in the Nashville morning light and watched her wave, and I thought about everything that had been built to make moments like this conditional. A typed document with sections and headers. A signature line, a monthly fee for the right to be a grandfather. And I thought about the kind of love that does not negotiate with any of that. The kind that just drives 2 hours and brings a stuffed rabbit and keeps showing up. I want to say something directly to you, if you are a parent or grandparent watching this, and you recognized any piece of what I just described. What happened to me has a name. When access to the people you love is used as leverage, when seeing your grandchild is made contingent on money, on compliance, on a calendar someone else controls entirely that is not boundary setting. It is coercion, and it works best on the people who love quietly, the people who do not want conflict, the people who believe that patience and good faith will eventually be rewarded if they just give it enough time. Patience and good faith are not a sufficient strategy when the other side is not operating in good faith. If you have given money to family for a house, a business, a new start, write it down, not because you expect something to go wrong, but because documentation is what protects the relationship when something does. A simple written note confirming the amount, the terms, whether it is a gift or a loan, that piece of paper is not a statement of distrust. It is the thing that keeps distrust from growing later into something that cannot be managed. If you are a grandparent in Tennessee, or in most other states, you have legal options. They are not unlimited, and they vary by state, and they require evidence that access is being unreasonably denied. But they exist. I did not know that before I called Patricia home. I am telling you now because maybe you don't know it either, and maybe knowing it changes what you do next. And if you are watching someone you care about being slowly separated from their family, a grandmother following a printed schedule just to sit on a couch, a grandfather whose calls are being routed through someone else's email, say something. Not to create a confrontation, but because the person being managed often cannot see the full shape of what is happening from inside it. They are too busy trying to follow the rules. My daughter called me this past Tuesday. She said my granddaughter had finally figured out how to pump her legs on the swing set at school, after weeks of trying, and had come home and announced it to the household with the formal gravity of someone delivering genuinely significant news. My daughter had recorded it on her phone. She sent me the video before she even hung up the call. I have watched it 11 times. My wife would have lost her composure completely over that video. She would have sent it to everyone in her contacts. She would have described it in detail to the woman behind her in the checkout line at the grocery store. She would have made it her phone's lock screen by nightfall. I like to think she saw it first.